existing plant to create a smaller new plant. And this is a very useful technique used with a lot of our house plants that get real leggy and lose all the leaves at the bottom, like a croton or a Dieffenbachia. We could air layer or create roots for the top portion of the plant and get rid of the leggy stems. We can also use it with woody ornamentals like camellias and hollies, and it is the fastest way to produce a good-sized rose bush on its own rootstock. The basic technique involves wounding the stem of the plant and then wrapping that in sphagnum moss and allowing it some time to root. And once it's rooted, we'll cut it off the plant and pot it up, we'll have a new plant. So to get started, we want to look for a portion of the plant that we're going to root. If we're air layering in the springtime, we want to look for some of last year's woodier growth. And if you're air layering midsummer, you want to use some of the current season's growth that's a little bit more tender. The size of the aerial portion where we're making our air layer is going to dictate the final size of our plant. You want to use at least a 1-foot section or a little bit larger. But more importantly, you want to find a stem that's around pencil size or a little bit larger when we're working with woody tissue. So I've identified a site where I'm going to make my air layer here on this stem. And the first thing I want to do is go in and remove all of the leaves and any stems or branches that come out within about 3 or 4 inches of my site where I'm going to air layer. And we're going to make the air layer at a node, which is where we have a branch or a leaf coming off the main stem. Now, since we're air layering roses, we also need to remove the thorns because we're going to wrap this in plastic to keep the moisture in, and if we have thorns in that area, they're going to poke through the plastic. Now, once we've cleaned up the section of stem, we're going to come in and remove a piece of the bark, and we're going to do that using a sharp blade. I'm using a grafting knife. You can also use a box cutter or even a nice sharp paring knife from your kitchen will do the job. Anything that's sharp that'll cut through this tough outer layer. So to peel the outer bark around, we're going to cut all the way around the stem in 2 places about 1.5 inches apart. And once we get a ring all the way around, we're going to go ahead and cut along the stem. Cut a linear line connecting the 2 pieces. And then use the tip of your blade to start peeling that bark up. And depending on how well you cut, it'll come off very easily, or you might have to make a couple of cuts to get in there and remove the entire section. We're just taking the outer layer off, and you can see that it's sort of more fibrous and thicker. But we're going to leave this under layer intact. And this is where the roots are going to develop as we're air layering. The next step is to put some hormone on this. And we're using a rooting hormone, and I'm using Hormex number 3 and just dusting it on the site. And this is going to help the roots to develop better. Next step is to wrap the wound with sphagnum. Sphagnum moss is going to provide the moisture to the wound site necessary for rooting. It also has some antibacterial properties to help prevent disease in the wound site. Now, sphagnum can be very hard to get wet, so we want to soak it in water for several hours. And when we're ready to wrap it, grab a handful and squeeze out all that extra moisture. It's hard to wet initially, but once it's wet, it holds moisture for a long time. And that's why we're going to use this to wrap our wound. So when you get a handful squeezed out, I might have grabbed a little much, we're going to go ahead and wrap it around the wound site. You want to have a nice thick bundle in here. And we're going to hold this in place by loosely wrapping it with some string. And it's important to keep the moss in tight because we don't want any of it sticking out at the bottom. And we'll look at that when we wrap with plastic. Once we have our moss in place, we're going to wrap it with plastic, and this is going to keep the moisture in while our roots develop. We want to be careful while you're putting the plastic on to not get it caught on any thorns on the rose bush, because we don't want any holes in there. We want it to hold moisture very well. And I'm going to use a butcher's fold on one end and then wrap the extra around, and that'll keep that moisture in and keep it from opening. We want to gather the top edge together and secure it to the stem. You can use electrician's tape, or I'm just going to wrap it with some twist ties and hold that in place. It's very important that while we're wrapping it that none of this sphagnum moss protrudes out, because if it does, it's going to act like a wick and it's going to dry out all the sphagnum in here. Even if just one little piece is protruding out, it can dry out the entire ball. So we want to be very careful to both get the plastic secure and make sure that all of our sphagnum moss is inside. Once we have our plastic secure over our moss ball, we simply wait. Be patient. It can take several weeks for roots to develop. Once we see the roots starting to develop through the moss, we're going to come back of our moss ball. It's time to remove that layer from the mother plant. And we do that by cutting just below the ball of moss. You want to use a nice sharp knife or pruning shears. We could put this in the ground or we could pot it up, which I'm going to do, but first I wanted to take a look at some of our failed air layerings. Air layering is a difficult process and it's not always successful. On some of the ones I've tried, I found grasshoppers chewed holes in my plastic and the whole moss ball dried out. In some cases, I found that the plant produced a great amount of callus tissue and just really started sealing over the wound site. You can see the top of the plant still quite healthy. It's just sealing itself and growing as happily as if I never cut into the stem. I have another one where the entire tip of the plant simply died out where I had made the wound. I'm going to pot our new plant up into a container. As I mentioned, you can also put it directly in the ground. You want to just make sure you've prepared a good planting bed. Be careful as you handle this not to disturb the roots. Keep that ball of moss intact around the root ball and just fill the soil in around it. Now if you're putting this in the ground, you might consider staking the plant, especially if it's going to be in a windy location. That'll help support it as it develops. Okay. As our plant establishes, especially the first week, we want to create a humid environment. You can cover it with a clear bag, and that'll trap the moisture in, mist it a little bit inside, and keep the bag over the plant for about a week or a week and a half. After about a week, go ahead and start cutting little holes in your bag, and what this is going to do is create openings where the moisture can escape slowly, and the climate inside the bag will slowly start to match that outside. Cut a couple more holes every day or two, and then eventually the inside and the outside are going to match, at which point you can remove the bag. You want to keep your new plant in a location that's protected from direct sunlight. So put it in a filtered sunlight or a shady spot. And if you're putting it in the ground, you want to keep the moisture level constant, and you want to try to cool the soil around the roots. So put a good heavy layer of mulch over that. Keep your plant moist but not too wet. You don't want the roots to rot inside of the container. And eventually those roots are going to become stronger and we're going to have a nicely established new